The senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the majority leader, senior senator from South Carolina, the junior senator from Oklahoma, and the junior senator from North Carolina be authorized to sign duly enrolled bills or joint resolutions from the 27th of June through the 8th of July.
Without objection.
Mr. President, on a separate topic, and I'm going to try to do this here in about 12 minutes, seeing that I'm not sure how many people are left to speak tonight, and I know the staff's worked hard, and we'll be up early tomorrow here voting on the pending amendment, the Udall amendment. This is what I want to talk about. And I've watched all week the debate on some of these topics. So I think it's a really good debate, actually. And in some ways, I'm very pleased that the amendment's been offered because it's given us an opportunity to talk about a topic that I don't think we talk enough about, and that is foreign policy, the security threats before our country, and in particular what the role of Congress is in all of this. There's a couple things that I want to say at the outset. Here's the first is that a lot of people that cover this stuff in the news, they like very simplistic terms. It makes it easier to write the articles. It makes it easier to describe the circumstances. And so the term people like to use is hawk or dove or, warlike or wanting to do war. I'm not in favor of war. I've actually never advocated for a military attack on Iran in these circumstances especially. And there's a lot of reasons for it. It would take me more than 15 minutes to explain it all. Suffice it to say that it is certainly not the first or the second. The policy of the United States in Iran today is the one I support, and that is crippling economic sanctions that deny them the money to do the bad things that they do, but also a force posture that we are prepared. We have enough people there in the military so that if they do attack us, we can defend ourselves. So I wanted to say that at the outset. I'm not here today to speak in favor of war or to call for war, but to speak about reality and the situation as we face it today. The second thing I want to point to is that there's this notion out there that there's some sort of clear-cut constitutional limitation on the president when it comes to the use of force in virtually every circumstance, and that somehow he, the current president, is being enabled by the members of his party here to do whatever he wants. That's just not true, and I'll explain why in a moment. But I want to begin with why we're even here. And it's one of the topics that's been touched on this week, which I think deserves a direct response. If you listen to the people on the floor, I heard a number of the senators that came to the floor. I watched the debate last night. There'll be another one tonight in the Democratic Party. And you almost get a sense that what they're arguing is that Iran was under control and wasn't doing anything wrong until Donald Trump came along and pulled us out of the Iran deal. That's just not true. That is patently false. The only thing Iran wasn't doing is enriching beyond a certain threshold, enriching uranium. And that's not necessarily a bad thing that they weren't doing it, but that's the only thing that that deal covered. Here's what Iran was still doing. Iran was still sponsoring terrorism. And you ask, well, why is it they sponsor terror? Iran wants to be the dominant power in the Middle East. And one of the ways they seek to achieve it is to find all of these groups, Hezbollah, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, and empower those groups. They have an organization called the IRGC, which is the real military and the real power in Iran. And underneath the IRGC, there's an organization called the Quds Force, which is their covert operations unit, led by a guy named General Soleimani. And he goes around the entire region sponsoring these groups, training them, providing them weapons. And here's what they hope to do. If they ever get into a conflict, they use these groups to attack people. Why do they use those groups? Number one, because Iran doesn't have the ability to station troops all over the region. Number two, because it gives them deniability. They can say, we didn't attack you, it was the Houthis, or we didn't attack you, it was a Shia militia. It allows them some level of deniability while still inflicting pain. And if you want to know what else Iran has done using that strategy, it has maimed or killed hundreds of American servicemen and women in Iraq. All those IEDs that were blowing up, they didn't buy those things on Amazon. They didn't order it on eBay. These IEDs were built and supplied by the Iranians. That's who did it. There's no dispute about that. So President Obama signs this Iran deal. Iran begins to get more money into their treasury because they can now engage in certain economic activity. What did Iran do with that money? Let me tell you what they didn't do. They didn't build schools. They didn't build roads and bridges. They didn't reinvest it in their economy or their education system. Iran took the money that they were making from the Iran deal. The Iran deal now allows them to engage in commerce that they weren't allowed to. They took that extra money and they used it to sponsor terrorism, to sponsor Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah, do you know Hezbollah today not only has more missiles than they had 10 or 15 years ago, their missiles are even better than they were. So they could now theoretically overwhelm Israel's defenses with volume of attacks, barrages. And they have guidance systems on those missiles now. In fact, they've gotten so much assistance from Iran, they don't even need to ship these missiles to them anymore. They can make it themselves. Or about the Houthis. The Houthis were a group that already existed, but they were only able to make the gains they've made in Yemen with Iranian support. You read in the news every day, it doesn't get a lot of coverage, these missiles and these drones that are used by the Houthis to attack into Saudi Arabia. Where do you think they bought these things from? You think they made it? We didn't sell it to them. Those are Iranian missiles. All of it provided by this additional money they got their hands on. They also conduct cyber attacks. And here's the most dangerous part of the Iran deal. It dealt with an uranium enrichment and the supervision, but it did nothing with the missile system. To have a nuclear threat, you need to be able to do three things, really. Number one, have a bomb design, which is the easiest part, believe it or not. Number two, have the capacity, the industrial capacity, to enrich uranium to weapon grade. And that's just a function of time and willingness. Once you can enrich at any level, you can keep going. And that's what the deal dealt with. And the third thing is you have to be able to deliver it, meaning you have to be able to launch it on something to reach your target. And the deal with Iran did nothing on the missiles. It gave them more money, and they used some of that money to build missiles that now have longer ranges. So where Iran 5 years ago had a more limited range of places they could strike, today Iran could strike virtually every capital in the Middle East and every U.S. base in the region. Every one of them. That's where they were putting this money. And so that Trump administration comes in and says, let me get this right. We did a deal with Iran. They get a lot more money. They use that money to build better missiles, to sponsor terrorism, to conduct cyber attacks. And the only thing is they can't enrich uranium for a period of time until the deal goes away. That's not a bad deal for Iran, because what they were banking on is that in 10 years we'd be focused on something else, the world would forget, and all of a sudden they would then be able to enrich. So the deal was a fraud. It did nothing to make Iran less dangerous. The only thing the deal did is slow down their enrichment capability, but at no time are they less than a year and a half to 2 away from breaking out to weapons grade. And at some point they would. At least they retain that very option. So this idea that somehow Iran wasn't doing anything wrong, but this deal is what pulling out of the deal is what's caused all these tensions, is just not true. It's not true. Even with the deal in place, Iran was arming and training and equipping all of these groups in the region and conducting cyber attacks and building these missiles unabated. Unabated. That's what was going on. Now they're feeling it. And by the way, Iran today is generating a lot less revenue than they were when the deal was in place. And we're at a point now where even Hezbollah is out there openly saying we've had to cut back. We have budget cuts. They're putting stuff out, including leaflets and things they've posted publicly inside of Lebanon, asking people to donate to Hezbollah, because Iran can't donate as much as they used to. They have real fiscal constraints. That's not a bad thing. Likewise with some of these Shia militias and others. It has constrained Iran's ability to operate. And so Iran has decided that the only way to reverse this is to force us back to some negotiation at some point to either A, intimidate us back into the deal, or B, force us to the negotiating table to get something like it. Well, how can they do that? How can Iran position itself with some strength in order to get into that kind of negotiation? They can't sanction us economically. The only thing they can do is these terrorist attacks, these sort of attacks that they started to conduct. And that's what they are in the pattern of doing. Do you realize that last week, over a period of 7 days, every single day there was a Shia militia attack against a U.S. installation? Luckily, nobody died, but that was happening. That is what they were trying and are trying to do. They are trying to accumulate and position themselves, accumulate some strength, so they can get into some future negotiation from a position of strength. And the only thing they think they can do that is by threatening to attack us. And most interestingly, to attack us with some level of deniability. So you have this tanker out there in the middle of the Gulf, a huge ocean, and suddenly some mines blow up, and you've got people, you actually have some journalists and some politicians that are saying, well, how do we know it was Iran? Well, who was it? It wasn't the Swedes, it wasn't the Germans, it wasn't the French, it wasn't Luxembourg. There's only one organization in that part of the world with the capability to do what happened. Iran. And everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. And the only reason why some countries don't admit it is because then they have to do something about it. Like if you're a European country and you want the Iran deal to come back in place and you want to be able to save it, you can't come out and say, we know Iran put those mines on those ships. You can't, because if you say that, then you got to pull out of the deal. So that's why they wouldn't acknowledge it. We have them on video. I even heard some people say, well, how do we know those were Iranians? Guys, this is ridiculous stuff. By the way, the mines look identical to the ones Iran makes. So they did that. But what really changed, so that was their plan, okay? Their plan was to attack us using other forces, but have some level of deniability. It wasn't us. And they know there's divisions in American politics. The president's unpopular in many countries. A lot of people around the world and in the US would love nothing more than to say, yeah, how do we know it was Iran? For different reasons. That's what they were banking on. But then they shot down an unmanned US vehicle, and they admitted it was them, because that would be very difficult to deny. And that's what really kicked off a lot of this argument that you're now hearing. But I want everybody to remember, if you go back 3 or 4 weeks, okay, there were people in this building, and there were people on television, I saw them, commentators and others, who were basically implying that this was all not true. That there was no threat emanating from Iran, that they weren't doing anything unusual. Now they're admitting that they are doing something unusual and dangerous. But 3 or 4 weeks ago, they were basically implying that this was all being made up by people that wanted a war. Well, you think that through logically, that means there are dozens and dozens of career servicemen and women in the US Armed Forces and in the Pentagon who are basically lying to us about this. That's absurd. So we get to this point. And now I want to touch on, that's how it really got us here. It isn't the deal with Iran. It isn't pulling out of the deal that's caused them. This is who they've always been. This is what they have always done. And they've been doing it for 2 decades now and longer. To somehow act like Iran is more belligerent today than it was 6 months ago or 6 years ago is just not true. It's just that the threats became more imminent directly against us. Now, you look at this amendment, and basically the amendment is designed to say the president cannot enter into a war unless Congress approves it. And it's an interesting dynamic because, number one, let me say this, a lot of it is built basically, when you hear people saying you need authority from Congress, what they're talking about is a war powers resolution. And that was that in the aftermath of Vietnam, in that era, Congress said from now on, we're not getting into any more of these undeclared wars. If a president's going to commit servicemen and women for an extended period of time, they have to come through Congress. No president, no administration has ever accepted that resolution as constitutional. Every single administration, Democrat and Republican, from that point forward, have all taken the position that this is an unconstitutional infringement on the power of a commander-in-chief. That's been the official position of every administration, Republican and Democrat, since that has been passed. Nonetheless, on various occasions, presidents have come to Congress for authority, which I think is a smart thing to do, especially for an extended engagement, because we are stronger and our policies are more effective when Congress and the American people are behind you. And that's why President George W. Bush sought that authorization for Afghanistan, and he sought one for Iraq. It was the right thing to do. It made sense. But no president has ever admitted that that is constitutional, and I share that view. But let's assume for a moment that it were. Well, that resolution lays out 3 things that must happen before a president, a commander-in-chief, can commit U.S. forces to a hostility, to a war, to a fight. The first thing, there has to be a declaration of war. That's in the Constitution, too. Congress can declare war. The second is that Congress can authorize the use of force. And that's where you hear all this talk, authorization for use of military force, AUMF. That's what we had in Afghanistan, that's what we have in Iraq, and that's what a lot of people around here think we need if we're going to do something with Iraq. But there's a third component they like to ignore. And the third component is a president can institute U.S. military action if Congress declares war, if Congress authorizes the use of force, or number 3, if there is an emergency and that causes us to respond to an attack against the United States, our territories or holdings, or our armed forces. Now, I want to tell you that if a Shia militia attacks a U.S. base in Iraq, that's a pretty clear attack on the armed forces. If it shoots down one of our unarmed platforms, unmanned, unarmed platforms over international airspace, that's an attack on our armed forces. If they try to kidnap or murder an ambassador or a diplomat by attacking our embassy, that's an attack on a U.S. territory, since embassies are sovereign territory. And so if you look at what the administration has done, the only thing the administration has done when it comes to use of force is they have made sure that we have enough ships and enough airplanes and enough personnel and enough assets in the Middle East so that if we are attacked, we can respond. That's the only thing they've done. And I don't know how you read the plain text of the language that they are wrapping themselves around, those who criticize what the administration has done, and not realize that it's fully authorized. If we are attacked, the president doesn't just have a right to respond, he has an obligation. And think of the reverse. If the Iranians were to attack a facility in Iraq and murder 100 Americans working at an embassy, diplomats, or killed 200 soldiers, the first question that every one of the president's critics is going to be on TV talking about is, why didn't we have enough force in the region to protect them? Why didn't we have a plan to save them? And there would be congressional hearings, and there would be members of Congress screaming at the administration, why didn't you have people there to save them? Well, anticipating that that could happen, our military leaders, looking at the threats, understanding the environment, asked the administration to send additional forces to be prepared, to be in a position to have enough people and assets to respond in case of an attack. I would go further than that. Imagine the president is given verifiable information that an attack is imminent by Iran or one of its proxies, and the only way to save American lives is to wipe out the place that they're going to launch that attack from. That is self-defense. Even if you acted first, you are getting ahead and preventing an attack. Not to mention the fact that the best way to respond to an attack is to prevent it from happening in the first place. And having a force posture in the region that does it is one of the best ways to do that. That is the only thing that's been done here. And so this amendment is just not necessary. Because assuming that they're arguing that the War Powers Resolution makes pretty clear what Congress's power and role is in all of this, under that, in the very text of that law, in the very text of that resolution, it makes clear that a president has a right to introduce military forces and to use military force to defend Americans, to defend America, and to defend our armed forces. And so why do we need language that says that a second time? So some would say, well, if it's redundant and it's already the law, why not just vote for it again? And that is the final and perhaps the most important point in all of this. And that is the timing couldn't really be worse. It's not necessary, but the redundancy here is actually damaging. And here's why. I think sometimes we make a terrible mistake in American politics. We ascribe our attributes to the leaders of other countries. So we hear the president of Iran said something, and we think their president and their system is like ours. It's not. The president of Iran doesn't have 1/10 the power of our president, meaning there's a supreme leader, and everything goes to the supreme leader, a cleric. That's where the power really resides. Number two, we make a terrible mistake to believe that they truly understand us, our systems, and our debates. They don't. Especially the Ayatollah. This is not a world traveler, nor a constitutional expert, nor a consumer of a varied amount of news and information from around the world, or a nuanced person who understands that this amendment, for example, is never going to become law. But here's what they do believe, and I encourage every member here to go out and inform themselves on this. You have, as senators, you have the opportunity to do it. Here's what they do believe. They do believe that this president cannot respond, or at least they did, that this president cannot and would not respond. They believe that there's a threshold, that there's X number of Americans they can kill, that there's certain types of attacks they can get away with without taking a response back. That's what they believe. Why do they believe it? Number one, because our president's talked on various occasions about withdrawing all Americans from the region. So they begin by believing that by and large he doesn't even want to be there. Number two, because they believe that because they look at our domestic politics. And they say, I've heard the debates, I watched 5 minutes of CNN or some other network the other night, and I heard people on there from Congress or wherever telling the president he can't do this and can't do that. There's no support in America for responding, and so the president is constrained in what he's able to do. Why is that a problem? Because that's where you miscalculate. That's where what they think would trigger a response and what will actually trigger a response are two very different things. And the risk we run, if this thing were to pass, and I know there's still a couple people thinking about voting for it, if this thing were to pass, this is not going to be reported as an amendment passed on a bill, but it's never going to become law because it's never going to get signed with that in there. That's not how it's going to be reported. In fact, if there's a close vote on it, as I anticipate there will be, the way it's going to be reported is even a handful of Republicans and virtually every Democrat voted to send the president a message: we don't want you using war against armed forces and force against Iran. That's how it's going to be reported. That's how they're going to read it. And it's only going to reinforce this belief among some in that regime that they can go further than they actually can. And I don't mean to say this to argue that there are members of this body here that are deliberately putting men and women of our armed forces in danger. I'm telling you, I don't know if you've thought through that part of it. But what we do here and how it is perceived in other parts of the world, especially in a reclusive organization such as the regime in Iran, are often two very different things. And the danger with this amendment is that it is going to confirm to several hardliners in that regime that the president is constrained, that their president will not be able to respond, that they will be able to get away with more than they actually will get away with. And so in some ways, ironically, I believe that even a big vote on this, but certainly passage of it, increases the chance of war. And I say that because if they miscalculate and they read into this an opportunity to attack at a higher level without taking a retaliatory response, they're going to do it. And then they're going to be wrong. And then the retaliation will come. And then it's on. And then we can't predict what happens next. What happens next is terrifying to even contemplate. Because what happens next could be a Hezbollah strike against Israel, and Israel responds 10 times stronger. It could be Hezbollah moving to abduct, kill, murder American diplomats or personnel inside of Lebanon. It could be Shia militias throughout Iraq and Syria attacking U.S. personnel. It could be increased Houthi attacks, not just into Saudi Arabia, potentially even hitting civilian populations, and Saudi Arabia responding back. What could come next is a spiraling series of events that leads to a dangerous regional war. And that is not an exaggeration, nor is it an exaggeration to believe that miscalculation on the part of Iran of what they can get away with would trigger that. So this is an unnecessary amendment, because if you accept the War Powers Resolution as valid under our Constitution, I do not, but if you did, it already says the president has a right to respond in self-defense. And the administration has made very clear that is the only way they intend to use it. They have made it abundantly clear. And in fact, their force posture proves, if you look at what we have in the region, the number of ships, the number of people, we're not postured for an invasion or an all-out war. We are postured for defensive operations and retaliatory strikes to an attack. And that's what they said they intend to do. What they intend to do is to continue forward, strangling the sources of financing that the Iranian regime is using to sponsor terrorism and their ballistic missile program, and have enough force in the region to protect our men and women serving us if they were to come under attack. And the president is allowed to do that in the Constitution and in the War Powers Resolution. And all this amendment does is create a dangerous opportunity to be misread and to cause Iran to do something, and that will trigger a response, and then we will have a war. And so I hope that those who are considering still voting for this because they want to reassert Congress's role, this is the wrong time and place to do it. I'll close with this. I don't agree with all the president's foreign policy views. I can tell you that, for example, I do believe that openly talking about getting out of the Middle East as soon as possible has emboldened some of this thinking, that America's constrained and we really don't have the dedication or the commitment to seeing this through if we are attacked. But in fairness, this president is far less likely to get into a war or start one than his predecessors, or his two predecessors, actually. He showed great restraint the other day. And so it strikes me that not only is this unnecessary from a policy perspective, it's also unnecessary from a personality perspective. This is not a president that's looking to start wars. This is a president that's looking to get out of ones that we're already in. And so, again, I just don't know why we would run the risk of putting something out there that could be misconstrued and lead to an attack when we have a president that has no intention of starting a war. We have a military posture in the region that would not support an offensive military operation or anything close to what Afghanistan or Iraq was like. And we have this danger of miscalculation. So the amendment's been filed. There'll be a vote on it tomorrow. And I just hope that there are a handful of people that are still thinking about it, that they'll consider all these points. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.